Good afternoon and welcome to our first in our series, the Wisconsin Cover Crop and Conservation Conversations. This webinar is sponsored by the Cover Crop Research and Outreach Project, a collaboration between the U.S. Dairy Forage Research Center, the Michael Fields Agricultural Institute, and the University of Wisconsin-Madison Center for Integrated Ag Systems, as well as the Nutrient Pest Management Program. So I'm Jamie Patton with the Nutrient Pest Management Program, and I'm going to be your webinar host for today. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to invite our first speaker, who is Dan Smith from the Nutrient Pest Management Program, and Dan and Mrill Ingram from the Center for Integrated Ag Studies will be presenting on the CCrop Cover Crop Citizen Science Project.
Thanks, Jamie. Trying to get the PowerPoint to share.
Maybe while you're doing that, Dan, I'll just start with a little context. Again, my name's Mrill Ingram, and I'm with the Center for Integrated Ag Systems on campus, and I'm super happy that we're doing this series. I'm really looking forward to it, and I wanted to thank the folks involved, and especially Jamie. It's just a real pleasure to work with someone who can make things happen. So we did this in a fairly short time frame, but it seemed like there was a lot of really good information out there, and this is looking forward to this opportunity. So as Jamie mentioned, the CCrop project that I'm part of with CIAS is a multi-institutional team of folks within the university, researchers, people in extension, also Michael Fields, community partners, and we began working in 2017, really trying to respond to all these emerging questions about cover crops, which people are interested in using more, but they're very place specific. There's a lot of unanswered questions about them, especially in Wisconsin, you know, how they work and why and when sort of thing. So we really we're aware of the need for more additional place specific data. And in addition, just needing to know more needing to hear more from agricultural educators and more from farmers about interests and concerns around cover cropping. So the project was very interested in using something like a citizen science approach from the beginning, and participatory approaches where we're really working more closely with folks on the ground and practitioners. So even before COVID hit, we were thinking about these things, and then it turned out that a citizen science project was one of the things that actually worked pretty well last year when it was so hard to get into the field and to survey and talk to people in person. So we set up a project reaching out to farmers around the state, and this is an ongoing project, and Dan is going to talk about the setup and the results from that project. But again, we're keen on this approach as it really allows us not only to gather data, it's not just this one-way thing, but it's a chance to also learn more about how people are using cover crops and their real interests and concerns about it. So just one other thing is that there is a website associated with our project, and we've got a research brief kind of final report from this work, which is also available there. That you can find out more about. So Dan, you were going to tell us a little bit more about how we pulled all this together and what happened.
Thanks, Mrill. Great introduction to the project. So last year we set out to survey cover crops throughout the state of Wisconsin. We began promoting the survey in early summer of last year, and we sent out invitations to participate to about 2,500 farmers, researchers, agronomists, and conservation professionals throughout the state. And we targeted the producer-led group participants as well, so through the DATCP farmer-led program. And very excited that we received 15 farmers that allowed us to visit this fall and collect biomass from those farms. The zip code is represented in the map to the right. And of course, the information that we collected from these farms is confidential. So we're going to share an overview today of the data that we collected and show some trends of that data that we learned. About half of the areas that we collected data from, we had very little information on cover cropping practices. This was particularly true in that Eau Claire region and north of Eau Claire. And then also we had some great sites in the Green Bay and the Door-Kewaunee region that we received some new data to the database as well for. So diving into the results of this project, one of the first survey questions we asked all the farmers to fill out an online Google Forms survey that had about 22 questions on it. And one of the very first questions was, what kind of cover crop experience do you have? Cover crop experience ranged from 1 to 10 years, with the largest group, 5 producers, reporting they had about 4 to 6 years of experience. This is shown in the graph on the right-hand side of the screen. In the printed publication, this is referred to as Figure 3. So some of you may have received that via an email or a mailing if you're a participant of this research. And Mrill said that written report is posted online and was sent out through the Wisconsin Crop Manager. If you'd like a copy of that, feel free to reach out to us as well, and we can make that happen. We also asked these producers how they selected their cover crop species. 9 respondents, all of whom had 7+ years of using cover crops in their farm, used that personal experience that they had gained by using cover crops. Everyone else identified an agronomist, a seed dealer, or farmer-led network collaborator as their primary source of information. So we were really curious about how others were learning about cover crops, and it was great to know that there was a lot of personal experience being built up on these farms that they could rely on for selecting those cover crops. Previous species was something we were really interested in seeing how producers are working to get a cover crop established on their farm. Probably not a surprise to many on the call today, but winter wheat was the primary species. They planted cover crops after winter wheat crops. Corn silage was the second main crop utilized. And then we had 2 vegetable crops, so green beans and peas utilized. We had a few farmers that planted after soybeans and a few that planted after corn. 40% of the fields surveyed were winter wheat though. We had quite a few multi-species mixes planted on these farms. 10 out of 15 producers surveyed had a multi-species mix planted, and this ranged from anywhere from 2 to 6 species of cover crops. For the producers planting a single species of cover crop, annual ryegrass and winter cereal grains were the most common, and these included rye, wheat, and triticale. And then volunteer wheat was a noted concern as a common volunteer in these cover crop fields. And of course, that would be common in these winter wheat fields. We would expect to see that, and can be a great cover crop as well. We were curious to know about the establishment method. This slide surprised me a little bit. 67% of the farmers indicated they were using tillage prior to cover crop establishment. No-till methods were utilized on 33% of the fields, and the primary planting method was a grain drill for 80% of the surveyed fields. Soil fertility management, we were curious to see how soil fertility was being managed on these farms. Almost all the respondents indicated that they were using University of Wisconsin-Madison Extension recommendations for their soil fertility information. So they were likely using a nutrient management plan. And then the research fields surveyed were primarily classified as a fine textured silt loam soil. So we didn't have any trial sites in, say, the central sands or the heavier clay regions on the eastern side of the state, primarily fine textured silt loams, but we did have a wide variety of geographic locations and climates included in that survey, as that map indicated on that first slide. Cover crops and manure are always a hot topic. I just presented an hour before this, and that was one of the main questions the group had, was how can we incorporate manure and cover crops? And this is honestly one of the most common questions we received. So this was great to hear how producers are incorporating manure into their cover crop stands. 47% of the survey respondents indicated they were using manure. 4 out of 15 fields receive a manure application prior to cover crop establishment. 5 out of 15 fields received a manure application after cover crop establishment. 2 fields received manure application before and after cover crop establishment. And then liquid manure was the dominant manure used across these fields. And we asked for rates for manure being applied, and it was 10 to 15,000 gallons of manure being applied to these cover crop fields. We collected cover crop biomass as one of the main metrics of the survey. This allows us to calculate how many dry matter tons are produced per acre, and that's an important metric. The photos here show how we collected these. I know this is a very common question among producers interested in looking at how much biomass they have produced out in the landscape. So we collected 3 half-meter squares, sampled randomly across these fields. These samples then were dried for 2 weeks at 120 degrees Fahrenheit, very dry heat source. in a commercial dryer. However, if you wanted to do this at home, I would recommend clipping approximately a ½ meter of biomass from an area and letting that dry on, say, an old window screen in a window. Spread that biomass out. Certainly don't keep it in a paper bag if you're trying to sample your own biomass at home, and dry that biomass out. So we had a very efficient way of collecting these biomass samples. As we traveled around the state, we gained a lot of knowledge about how much biomass we could expect from these different cover crop species. This is a data chart that's included in the printed publication. A couple of things I wanted to touch on. Dr. Greg Sanford did a really nice job correlating this to growing degree units, and we have a follow-up slide on that as well. If we look at some of this data, there's a trial site in Iowa County that was following corn grain, crimson clover, hairy vetch, oats, radish, and rapeseed were all planted as a cover crop species. This was drilled on September 22nd of 2020. I harvested the biomass on the 3rd of November, and we received a 1/10 of a ton of dry biomass per acre. So very small amount of biomass. However, we only had 450 growing degree days, growing degree units after planting that cover crop. So very small amount of growing degree units left in the season. If we jump down to this in Sauk County, for reference, these trial sites are less than 60 miles apart to drive to them. This previous crop was peas. This producer planted annual ryegrass, berseem clover, crimson clover, oats, radish, and red clover. This biomass was approximately 40 some inches tall when I went out and sampled, and they were grazing this cover crop. Cover crop was planted on the 18th of July. I harvested it on the 2nd of November. They averaged 3.2 tons of dry biomass, and they had received 2,100 growing degree units. So a huge difference in that planting timing. If we look at some of our wheat cover crops, so planting after wheat up in Barron County, annual ryegrass, berseem clover, crimson clover, red clover, dwarf Essex rape, planted on the 15th of August, and I was up there on the 6th of November. They averaged 2.8 tons of dry biomass, great stand of cover crops up in Barron County, and again, 1,400 growing degree units. So another interesting component of this data set, we asked these producers how they intended on terminating the cover crops. Fall frost or allowing these cover crops to winter kill was very common, along with planting green was also very common. What does this cover crop biomass mean, and why is it so important? Well, the biomass is going to help hold the soil in place over winter. It's going to help reduce erosion. It's going to help build soil health. It's going to help weed suppression. So biomass is a very important metric. It's one that we get asked very often, how much biomass can I expect out of these cover crops? If we look at from a view that I took when we were looking at calculating percent cover, you can see the difference. This was that stand in Iowa County. Again, a decent amount of winter rye out there, but not very much. This winter rye was a few inches tall. And again, it was in a mix. So there was a little bit of species variation in there, but many of those species were going to winter kill. So a lot of open soil, still some benefits because that winter rye is going to overwinter. We compare that to that winter rye stand up in Barron County. Nice stand. There was some volunteer wheat in there as well. But again, you see very, very little soil surface in that image. These images were taken about 40 inches tall or so above the soil surface, above the canopy of the cover crop. This is that stand in Sauk County. Again, look at that nice stand of diverse cover crops. Huge difference in planting date. It's one of the main take-home messages from that. Your crop rotation has a big impact on how much biomass you're going to anticipate to receive from these cover crops. Another graph from Dr. Sanford. He has a great database referred to for this publication as the CCrop Data set. It's all the different cover crop biomass research that has been done at the Wicks trial location at Arlington Research Farm. And this is looking at data he's compiled, and his data set's indicating that the most cover crop biomass is achieved in a fallow season. So not necessarily realistic for many of our cash grain farmers, but obviously our growing degree days really matter. And that's what this graph's indicating is the more growing degree days we receive, the higher, the more amount of biomass, the higher amount of biomass we can expect to achieve from that crop. Looking at some of the data for this study, for our winter wheat, 0.4 to 2.8 tons of dry matter were harvested after winter wheat. Corn silage, 2.2 tons of dry matter. Drilling after soybeans or corn were the least successful options with half a ton of dry biomass. And interseeding or removing the corn stover can improve these cover crop successes by about 1.5 tons. We asked for participant feedback in this survey to see what they were interested in learning more about. One of the most common questions was, again, I indicated regarding manure. How can I apply liquid manure to establish a cover crop following corn silage? So again, another common question, corn silage, corn grain, and soybeans are also in there. Are there inexpensive and practical ways to measure progress on soil health? That's a great question for Jamie Patton today on the call. Where can I learn more about multi-species cover cropping mixes? Can I reduce my fertilizer rates following a corn crop? A lot of interest in how we can use cover crops to help reduce some of our crop inputs. And then when planting green, can I wait until the corn emerges before terminating my rye cover crop? So these are some of those follow-up questions that we'll be working on addressing through more of our outreach efforts throughout the next year. With that, the next year, and there'll be more promotion on this next week, we're gearing up to do another survey. We'd be excited to have as many participants as possible. We will start promoting this in early summer. It's an online survey that we ask producers to fill out. And then there's a couple different parts to it. We'll ask for a survey to be filled out, and then we'll ask for photos of the cover crop to be sent in to us. Very simple photos we can take with our smartphone out in the field. And then we'll ask to come and visit the farm to collect a biomass sample. And that's really key to looking at how successful these cover crops are, is that amount of biomass. So again, please watch for follow-up information. On that, there is a farmer stipend associated with this project. So participating farms receive a stipend depending on which phase of the project they're participating in. We'd like to thank all the participants of this survey. We'd like to thank all the farmers that allowed us to come out and collect data on their farm. We'd like to thank everyone that sent data into us. We'd like to thank all the conservation professionals that collaborated on recruiting those farmers. I'm very appreciative of that effort. Again, the CCrop collaboration, the Michael Fields Agricultural Institute, UW-Madison Center for Integrated Agricultural Systems, CIS, the USDA Dairy Forage Research Center make up CCrop. I represent the Nutrient Pest Management Program in this collaborative. And then we'd like to especially thank Wisconsin NRCS for the financial contribution for the farmer stipend portion of the product of this project.
Thank you so much, Dan, for that presentation. So as we move into the lightning round of our webinar today, I'm asking Matt Brugger to start sharing his screen. So Matt is with Tilth Agronomy as well as the Upper Fox Wolf Demonstration Farm, and he's going to talk to us today about 30-inch corn interseeding cover crops. So slides look great, Dan, Matt, excuse me. So go ahead.
Thanks, Jamie. So as Jamie said, the 30-inch corn interseeded cover crop. Got some few pictures here I'll share with you guys. So here is the established crop. How did we establish? We used a Interseeder Technologies unit, which is basically a 15-foot drill that you take out row units from. So just to give you an idea of how that works, create the gaps for the corn rows. This particular mix is clover, annual ryegrass, and vetch, and we did that about 15 pounds. So we found over time and working with other growers and other demonstration farm personnel that 15 pounds is kind of your go-to rate to start. Anything less than that, it's hard to really establish anything. And talking to growers in other states, depending on your climate and your growing season, some are going as high as 20 to 30 pounds. So we are still kind of playing with what the magic number is when it comes to seeding rate, but at least that kind of 15, 16 pound rate seems to be a good starting point. So once you get the crop established, we don't want it to die, so you really have to consider your chemical program when looking at interseeding. In general, most of our interseeding farms are using Roundup or Roundup 2,4-D, some farms Roundup Verdict. You want something that's not going to have a lot of residual and take out your interseeded crop, which has typically been done around that V2 to V4 timing. Though with certain species we found, especially like clovers, establishing as early as possible is going to net you a better looking cover crop in the end. So the whole point of the interseeding into these crops generally is to establish a cover crop where we can't get it established after harvest. As Dan mentioned in his talk, the data on things tried to plant after corn and soybeans makes it very difficult to really get much biomass and establishment. So post-harvest of this mix, it does look a little spindly. It's been underneath that canopy for the majority of the growing season, but it is there. You're going to have some gaps from traffic and other things, but in this case, on this particular field, we then hit it with a low disturbance manure application. And so further into the season, we got more growth. We're getting both above and below ground growth. So the above ground in some places was up to about 12 inches on the ryegrass, and you can see the below ground growth. We have a good 2, 3, 4 inches of root mass there as well. So without having to go back and drill post-harvest and still being able to put on manure, we were able to establish a cover crop. And as you can see in the background of this picture, it did fill in pretty nicely. We didn't get as much of the clover and vetch as we did the ryegrass, but in the end, we still do have that cover crop established, and we continue to look at different mixes that will be good at establishing these crops moving forward. So it opens up a lot of opportunities. Some farms are interested in grazing the cover crops after they're established in the interseeding situation. So that opens up the potential for some feed value out of the cover crop. It's also there through the fall. In this case, annual ryegrass does have a tendency to sporadically survive the winter. So we're not expecting a full field of cover crop coming in spring. So as far as termination issues there, generally if you're doing any kind of burn down in the spring, you should be able to clean up those areas with either your initial pass of chemical or winter may take care of all of it. So opens up a lot of possibilities for gaining cover crops in those grain situations. Typically, the drilled version that we did here is going to give you a lot more better establishment than a broadcast. Broadcast we've had issues with where it may not be consistent or may not even establish if there's not adequate moisture. So it can be done. This particular field's up in the Bonduelle area, but we've seen it in several places around the state. So if you're looking for an option, consider 30-inch corn interseeding. Thanks, Jamie. That's all I got.
Thank you very much, Matt. So we will, again, please post all of your questions into the chat. We will address those after we get through our discussions, but we're going to transition over to Chelsea Zegler. So I'm pleased to introduce a project by Carl Simi from Biological Farmer Friends, a producer-led watershed in Dane County, Marie Ramboyne from the Dane County LCD, and Chelsea Zegler with Extension in Dane County. And as you can see, they're going to be talking to us again about interseeding cover crop forages into 30 and 60-inch corn silage and snaplage. So take it away.
Thanks, Jamie, for having us. Everything look and sound okay?
Sorry, yes, ma'am. Sure does.
Okay, thank you. Yep, so we're in Stoughton today, and we're going to talk about some interseeding cover crops. And kind of the reason behind this was we wanted to have some feed to graze later in the year with some high protein content. So hopefully I can go to our next slide here. Here we go. So Carl no-tilled 108-day corn in mid-May in both 30 and 60-inch rows, and I believe that was following rye cover crop that was terminated. And then we used a modified no-till grain drill at around V3, V4 to interseed at 15 pounds per acre, some different seed mixes in mid-June. So you can see from these pictures kind of what residue we were looking at and what soil conditions were like. So our actual plant populations on the 60-inch at least was around 28,000 plants per acre. So our goal was a little more, but we're still kind of working out the kinks. This is the first year that we tried this. Here's a video of what our interseeding looked like. So you can see it was a little dry, but we must have gotten some rain, and then the drill obviously helps with seed to soil contact. Here's some pictures throughout the year. This first one, you can see the Italian ryegrass on 30-inch rows. And the rest of these pictures are 60-inch rows with some cowpea mixtures. And you can see, you know, it looks pretty nice. And as an extension agent, it's really nice to walk through 60-inch rows instead of a 30-inch. So yields, we had a pretty high fertility field for our 60-inch silage, and we had a really healthy silage yield there. And unfortunately, we don't have a direct 30-inch comparison there. And for snaplage, you can see we did lose around 1.5 tons of snaplage with the 60-inch. But like I mentioned, we're still working out some of the kinks, and I think the forage story will help that yield look a little bit better and catch up to the 30-inch. So I apologize for this complicated table. Try to walk you through it. We had some different seeding mixes, but what I'd like you to focus on is we got, you know, much more forage in all of the 60-inch cover crop mixes compared to the 30, and that we had really high, good protein values, you know, adequate for beef nutrition at the end of the year. And we sampled these in mid-September, so, you know, some of these would have continued to grow later into the fall. Here's just another way to visualize that. You know, if you think our snaplage sorghum Sudan mix was, you know, an anomaly at how high the yield we got, you know, even these, you know, mid-level cowpea mixtures had 6 times more forage than the 30-inch. So even though we lost around 1.5 tons in snaplage yield, you know, we gained around 1 ton in dry forage biomass. So I think there's some potential there based on, you know, what time of year you need your forage and not wanting to haul manure and things like that. So plans for the future, herbicides are definitely something we're going to switch up in the future. I know Bill Stengel in the past has talked about, you know, not trying this on a field with water hemp or Palmer amaranth. So we did have some weed issues. We're going to play with planting rate and different corn varieties, flex year versus fixed year, and then trying some different seeding mixes, you know, simple ones, maybe 1 or 2 versus more complex, and try some summer annuals to try to take advantage of the heat in that June planting date. So here's our contact information, and I guess we'll save questions till the end. So thanks for the time, everyone.
Thank you so much, Chelsea. And we do have some questions coming in. Again, please post those questions in the chat as you get them. Next, we're going to have Amber from Calumet County. So Amber O'Brien with the local extension office, as well as is going to show us some of her local work with the Calumet County Agricultural Stewardship Alliance producer group in cover crops and in-season manure applications. So Amber has a great video for us today. So Amber.
All right, thanks, Jamie. And just setting a timer here so I don't get too chatty. I'm going to just maybe pause the video a couple of times here and there to explain what each of the segments are, but just a quick overview. We were just looking at applying manure into cover crops either before or after it was seeded. So we were just looking at different techniques on how to incorporate that manure or inject that manure versus top dressing after it's planted. So I'll let this first section play for a little bit and you guys can go ahead and get an idea of what we were looking at. wanted the soil pits, I just wanted to make a note. I talked to the farmer before he planted into those 2 sections where we did that minimum disturbance and then the potting or disc. And it was really dry at the beginning of August. And so when we applied that, he said he went out in the field and he could have went and planted that cover crop. Even though they're both at the same rates, he could have went and planted those oats the day after that manure was applicated, as opposed to he had to wait a couple of days to let that potting or disc application dry out before he could get into the field to apply that. So we'll look at that yield difference in a sec here. And with the soil pits, unfortunately, the one day that it rained in August by us, it was happened on our field day. So we actually even had dyed manure and everything. So soil pits didn't turn out quite as visual as what we had hoped. But our motivation behind each of these different techniques are the NR 151 standards as how it compares different manure applications and techniques, and the rules as to whether or not you have to incorporate it or not, and looking at the depth to bedrock and how much soil you have there. So that's why we did all these different application techniques, just to kind of measure how deep that manure infiltrated through the soil. So that's just a little bit of an overview of what we did for last year, and we've got some more planting green and some different ideas coming up this summer as well. But if you guys have any other questions, I didn't actually click start on my timer. I just put it up to 5 minutes, so we can save questions for after. And yeah, that's all. That's what I've got.
Thank you so much, Amber, and remind me to ask you if you're going to do a similar field day this year, because I know I'm watching a lot of faces that are interested in these different manure applications. So we'll discuss that after our last two presentations. So with that, our next speaker, and I'm trying to do double duty here, if I can get you to stop sharing your screen, Amber, and I'm going to share the screen for Barry Bubolz, who is with the Demonstration Farm Network, and Barry is going to be talking to us about the planting green on the Augustin and Deer Run dairies over in Kewaunee County. So if I can get my technology to work here. Let's see, is that showing up correctly? No, it is not. Let me fix that quick, Barry. All right, hopefully that's better. All right.
That looks good on my end. Can you hear me okay?
I sure can.
Okay, well, thanks, Jamie. First, I want to give some credit to Augustine Farms and Deer Run Dairy, two of our demo farms here in the Door-Kewaunee network. And so they're their dedication and their continued efforts in planting green and learning from that. We've been sharing those experiences across the networks and in some other ones. And so, Jamie, if you can slide on to or move over to the next slide, I'd appreciate that. So this just gives you a little bit of an idea of planting green. And so when we talk about planting green is no-tilling directly into a growing cover crop, or in some cases, we're also planting directly into alfalfa. And so what we're trying to do is just provide the best protection for the soil and the water resources that we have. You know, maintaining that active biology that we've got going with these cover crops. So we're not killing them, you know, way in advance. So we're keeping that biology going. And then as Dan was talking about, allowing for that increase in biomass. And so putting that carbon back into our soils. And so this picture here, obviously 2019 was not the most optimal year for planting conditions in the spring. And as you can see, here we are on June 7th. And that was pretty common in that area. And so the advantage that we had here is we kept that rye growing, just to, as we would say, to keep the water pump going. If that had been killed a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks prior, that field may still not be planted today because it would have never dried out. And so most years we're not really, you know, looking to probably have that much growth. It just depends on where you are at in the state. In this case here, we took biomass samples prior to planting, and we were getting anywhere from 3,000 to 4,000 pounds of dry matter across these fields. So just when we're taking into consideration these covers, we're looking at, you know, carbon and nitrogen ratios. Obviously, in the material that's shown here on the screen, our carbon to nitrogen ratio is much higher than maybe if we had been able to plant into 16, 20-inch rye. And so, Jamie, if you can slide on to the next picture, that'd be appreciated. So, like I said, depending on where you are in the state, if you know as far north as we are, you know, we want to get out there and get planted. So not leaving that cover go as long as it was there in June. So this slide right here kind of shows the progression. Same fields, basically the same angle. And you can see on June 25th, the corn's in there. July 8th, it's in there. It's not missing. It's just that the rye is still covering it up. But really makes that jump as we got into July 30th, and it's just a nice tabletop even field. And so, you know, some of the things we learned from this, obviously, going back, if we can get that rye down closer to the ground, whether that had been crimping it or rolling it, and harnessing all of that sunlight, that would have been more advantageous. One of the things that we're learning and that we're trying to make sure folks are aware of, if you're going to plant green into these kinds of situations, you need a reallocation of your nitrogen. And so the days of, you know, just putting on the starter and coming back and side dressing later is a recipe for disaster, I would say. So we want to be getting more of our nitrogen up front so we can get that crop up and out and through that cover crop, and then still coming back with a side dress. In this case, this field did receive manure, but as I mentioned, we had 3,000 to 4,000 pounds of dry matter, so we had a lot of manure that got locked up by rye. One of the other things, just learning from this, in these high fertility situations that we have in dairy country here in Northeast Wisconsin, if we know we're going to be planting green in the following spring, we can really fine tune that rye planting rate downwards. We don't need that. We don't need a whole bushel. We don't need, you know, a bushel and a half or even more, because that's just more material than we really need to plant, and we're still getting a really good benefit from the soil health and the protection to the surface. And so, Jamie, if you can move on to the next slide. This is Deer Run Dairy, just a few miles away. You can see the steeple from the Stengaville Church in the background. Just kind of giving you the same sequence of time frames. Again, it was a late planted situation in 2019, but yet extremely successful. And so I throw these two farms in. They're both very good at planting green. Augustine's use a red planter, you know, and Deer Run uses a green. We got people planting green with blue planters. So I like to say that, you know, just about any planter that's set up for no-till you can make work for planting green. So if you want to move over to the last slide that I got there. And so 2019, obviously late planted, late harvest. However, these fields just really shined in 2019. Jamie cut me down on the number of slides I could use, but I would have shown you some pictures of the field that's directly next door that was conventional. And there we were running axle deep trying to take silage off. And so the difference in having that soil structure, having that rye to ride on was just a night and day difference. We had custom harvesters that were literally fighting for where are the no-till fields, where are the cover crop fields, that's where we want to go. And so we got pictures of these fields where literally the tires on the dump carts were only going down about a lug deep, whereas in conventional fields we were pulling carts through. So just kind of a quick quick little presentation on planting green and some of the tricks to making it successful. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Barry. We appreciate your insight. And yes, I am mean. I cut you down on your slides. So Chelsea snuck a couple in on me, but we'll forgive her. So our last speaker of the day, so trying something new. So moving over to the northwest portion of the state, we're going to be hearing from Dave Fogerty with the Shell Lake Yellow River Farmer-Led Watershed, and Kevin Sheshow and Madeline Roberts with Washburn County Extension and their project on forage crabgrass as a forage in northwest Wisconsin. So Dave.
Well, hi from northern Wisconsin. I want to preface the video you're going to be seeing with the clarification that I raise grass-fed bison on a rotational basis, and it's on sandy soil. And that was kind of the motivation for going with crabgrass. So having said that, go ahead with the video if you'd like, and we can ask questions later.
Okay. Make sure I have this all set up for you.
Okay.
The crabgrass I tried to grow on my own, I saw an advertisement in the magazine, so I called the guy up, not sure that was even true that what he said could happen would happen. He's from Oklahoma, and he said I was the only guy in Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Michigan who was even trying to do this. So it was kind of a wild shot to begin with, but I'm really happy with the results. However, you do have to play with it somewhat before you figure out how to make this work. Again, the seed is uncoated, it hasn't been treated, anything, so it's very light, not quite as light as prairie grass, but almost. And so you have to plant the seed very shallow and then roll it with a heavy roller so you get that minimum contact and you'll get a good catch. What we tried to do and we succeeded in doing is we're trying to get this crabgrass to come back as a perennial.
Sorry for the buffering.
And it's a true annual, but we have been able to get it to work as a perennial, and that took me 4 or 5 years to figure out how to do this. It can be done. So that's where I'm at. Most of the stuff is what was here from last year. And if I let this go to seed, which I think I will do now, there'll be crabgrass all over here next year. If you lightly discard or drag it twice in the spring before it starts to come up. That seems to be what works best here in sandy country. So I'm really happy with it. It has great tonnage. The animals really like it. That is bison do anyway. And one more thing about the crabgrass. You can come out here like Randy Gilbertson and I just did 2 days ago, and we're saying it'll be ready to cut in a day or two. We came out here 2 days later, look at it today. It's already past its prime. So the negative with this is, if you get 2 or 3 days where it's going to be raining, you can't cut it, and then it gets away from you. So that's one negative. The other negative is, and there aren't many negatives, another negative is this, I gotta find one here. This stem is heavy, coarse, and has a lot of moisture in it. And so what would take 3 days for a regular hayfield to cure, to dry out enough to bale, this will take 4 or 5 days depending on the weather. So that's not something else you have to pay attention to. But for being drought proof and for tonnage, this is great stuff. But it takes a little technique and a little experiment to figure out how to make this work. It can be done.
Apologize for the buffering. I even changed offices to get better internet connection, and it still didn't work on me. So Dave, do you have any final comments before we move into questions?
Questions.
Go ahead. All right, so let's look in the chat. I've seen a lot of activity going on while we have been looking at our videos and listening to our presentations. So basically, and I know there's some answers in the question, but as a group, do you have an estimate of corn plant mortality after interseeding? So I know interseeding is really popular, gaining popularity across the state. So what can we expect for mortality?
Jamie, the first thing that comes to mind with some of the interseeding that I've been part of is matching the equipment size to the drill size or to the interseeding equipment. That way you don't get into that 30-inch row planted corn or that 60-inch row planted corn. So having that proper setup.
Yeah, I would agree. Also, you know, having the right driver and everything too, so you're not running on the rows. And like I said in the comments there, similar to what you'd have side dressing corn, as long as you stay off the rows, and you're gonna have some on the turnarounds when you're turning around in headlands, but that's any application, whether you're spraying or side dressing or doing anything else.
Yeah, we don't have much to add. I think almost every row unit of the drill was moved a little bit. But like I said in the chat, there was, you know, a 15-inch span on both sides of the corn. And then that bar just kind of hit the top of the corn just barely. We didn't experience much mortality.
Again, if you have questions out there, please post those in the chat, and we will get to address those. So Barry, we have a question. What is the rye seeding date during the fall of 2018? So when we look at planting green, what did you do? And just kind of from experience, where do you think you'll move to on that seeding rate?
Yeah, so up here in Northeast Wisconsin, we try to get our rye in, you know, before October 15th is kind of our standard. That was planted in September. The reason for the
From the smiles I'm looking at, that's probably happening on your end too. All right, Barry, Barry, you have some internet issues.
Fertility system. And so where's our target rate in manure? And if we're getting it planted in September, I'm sorry, can you hear me now?
Kind of. Keep going. We'll let Barry his internet to catch up. So I have a question.
About that.
No problem. Are you better?
I hope I'm better.
Yep. We can hear you now. So you might start over. What did you do and where are you going?
I'm just what I said was, in that case, that field was planted in September. It was a high fertility system. It had manure, so we had a lot of growth going out there. Going forth in dairy country here in high fertility systems, I'm not afraid to go down to a 25 pound per acre rate on rye, especially if we've got manure in the system. We're still getting a really good growth out there, and we're getting the benefit. A little bit easier to plant through.
Excellent. Thank you, Barry. And I know many of you out there in virtual world are planting green. So if you have thoughts on your rye application rate or rye seeding rate, please post those in the chat and we can discuss. So from Nick, what type of clover were you using with your interseeding? So Matt, Chelsea?
We were using red clover. You could use other clovers as well, crimson. They're red clover we use in particular because we wanted it to hopefully be there in the fall a little bit more to establish, and it does have the potential to overwinter. Not all clovers do, and there is some farms experimenting with Balancha clover, which is Rick Clark. If you've ever seen him talk, he does a lot down in Ohio. But that one needs to be established pretty early, and I haven't seen it in a interseeding situation where how well it would survive in that shade tolerant type environment. But yeah, mostly red is what we've been using.
Yeah, we had a little bit of Berseem in the mix, but not a lot. So we didn't see that much of it. Maybe we'll see some this spring. But I know red clover has worked in the past. Back in my technician days, we had some good response with that. And I think it would maybe work better in a 60-inch system since we'd get a little bit more light there, and then potential nitrogen credit for next year's corn.
Thank you, Chelsea. Barry, do you have anything you want to add?
They pretty much covered it. Red clover has been very successful, and we use a little bit of crimson too.
Excellent. I'm going to take a step back, and there is a question. What was the N application rate to offset the N tie-up from the rye? So what are you seeing that works?
I guess our starting point over here when we have rye is we're trying to get 60 to 80 units up front in the beginning for that corn to utilize and have available. So we did take pre-side dress nitrogen tests out there prior, and that pretty much confirmed that rye does a really good job of sucking up manure.
Barry, is that nitrogen rate, is that all commercial fertilizer on the planter, or is that counting the manure credits?
That was more on the planter.
Excellent. So we had a question. Did anyone take soil health tests prior to the practices being installed and then again after? And if so, do you have any comparisons? I see smiles.
If you're talking about university or soil health actual tests, not on those fields. We did do some infiltration rates, just comparisons. So from conventional to these fields. So depending on what you mean by soil health tests.
We haven't really. We intend to do more, but we haven't been using them on specific practices as much as just trying to get baselines for farms to see down the road what we'll get. This next year we are going to be doing some soil health test trials to try to figure out which soil health test is maybe going to give us results, because there's a few of them out there, and there is some contention, I guess, as far as what you're really getting out of them. So we're still kind of early in that process to really make recommendations based off of them. So.
Excellent, thank you. So for all of you, how early do you feel is too early for interseeding?
Yeah, I'll sneak in before you, Matt. So we just talked about it, and we thought we'd at least want to get the corn out of the ground first. but we just actually talked to Erin Silva, the organic specialist at UW, and she said she's been seeing a lot more V1 than the original plan, which was V3, V5. So it was only our first year, so maybe we'll push the envelope this year and go earlier.
Are you thinking the same thing for your 30 and your 60-inch rows, Chelsea? Or are you going to split that up?
That's a good question, Jamie. We haven't thought that much about it.
Well, then I'll turn to Matt. Matt, do you have a thought on that?
Yeah, we haven't done it specifically with our demo farms, but we've talked about, as long as the corn is spiking, you could get out there and drill it rather than having to, if you are worried about running over corn and all that, you want the corn to have a jump on what your cover crop's going to be. So, once it's kind of starting to come out of the ground, you're not going to do as much damage running it over, and as long as you're not riding right on the rows. So no, I don't know that there's that going right away would be much of an issue. So yeah.
And I can just say a quick 30 seconds here. It was 2019. We did we had corn. It was V2, V3, and we had the co-op come in one of our plots. They just broadcasted, and then we came through and incorporated manure into it, and that came up. That was just clover. That's all the co-op had actually at the time. That was late 2019 when everybody had pre-vet plant and whatnot. So so that came off really, really nicely. You could see it even after it was harvested where that plot was. We also tried putting the cover crop seed into the manure tanker and then injecting that cover crop seed with the manure. And that did not come up. And we're thinking maybe it was injected a little too deep for that clover. So we might try to scrape it a little bit lighter across the soil if we try that again. That was at V2, V3.
So before we wrap up, Dan, do you have anything you want to add to the interseeding discussion quick?
Just that weed control gets very challenging in those interseeding environments, depending on timing. So be mindful of your herbicide choices, or if you're going to row cultivate, row cultivation and broadcasting cover crops at the same time has been very successful. So think about weed control when you're thinking about that interseeding timing.
Thank you very much, Dan. And last but not least, I told you, Amber, would you please remind us, are you going to be doing some more manure work this summer if we have the opportunity to come see a field day?
Yeah, so we're looking at actually being able to bring a Cadman unit up, which you are able to apply manure into growing corn that is not just, that's beyond V4, which is the recommended highest point to drag over manure. So that's actually a unit where you go down the rows, and it's the hose pumps through into the unit, and then it has a big boom where you can turn around the headlands, and then it comes back and it reels that hose up, so you're not actually running over the corn rows. So hoping to do a pop-up field day this spring with that, or the late spring, and then this following that in August, we're also going to have that unit there. We're going to plant some corn into a wheat field, so just to have some established rows, and then people can actually really see that unit work even without, so they can see it without the corn really high as well. So that's that, and we're also going to be doing some live demonstration of some top dressing and minimum disturbance on growing corn as well, and dragging that hose across there. And we'll do live demonstrations this year so people can actually see how that corn responds to that hose dragging over the corn and then popping back up.
Thank you so much, Amber. So we are at our time. So I want to thank you again to all of our speakers, and I want to thank you all for attending today's webinar. We will return next Friday at 12 p.m. So same day, same time, with lightning talks on cover crop and conservation outreach activities across the state. If you haven't already, please pre-register for this event, and I posted that website in the chat. So thank you again for your attendance and your questions, and hope to see you next week.